Mythic Game Master Emulator 2nd Edition is a solo role-playing oracle by Tana Pigeon of Word Mill Games and illustrated by Jorge Munoz. The 1st edition was published in 2003 and has long been cited as one of the best tool sets for simulating a GM and enabling one to play a tabletop RPG alone. This latest version, 20 years in the making, streamlines several of the author's publications and generally presents a set of tools that has made it easier and more intuitive than ever to run solo. Here's the actual list of changes from the previous version. It's a pretty substantial list of changes and seems pretty impressive. My only experience with Mythic is with some cards that I could never figure out. This was a print-on-demand deck from DriveThruRPG, and interestingly, this deck of cards is never mentioned in the book, which is fine. This methodology presented in the 2nd edition is really pretty incredible for solo play, and I don't know if it would translate into cards anyway. I say solo because that's what Mythic is designed for, but as with any so-called oracle, it can be used with multiple players who don't have or want to use a living GM, or for players who want to co-GM. You can also use Mythic's workflow to emulate players, or even just as a writing tool that has no connection to a particular RPG rule set. This video is brought to you by Old Mage. Welcome to Old Mage, the spell-blasting adventure game of arcane domination. Explore ancient ruins. Battle fierce monsters, invoke mighty spells, and unleash powerful relics as you compete for the High Wizard's throne. Terrible foes and treacherous hazards await, yet none quite so terrible, nor so treacherous as your arcane rivals. Claim victory in one of two ways: find the Master Orb and deliver it to a mage tower across the Great River, or destroy your enemies with spell, steel, and guile. But beware, old mages do not die quietly. They become haunts that plague the living, or return as undead liches. 2 to 6 players, 1 to 2 hours. Is your magic strong enough, old mage? The foundation of Mythic's approach to guiding an adventure are your expectations of what should happen next, and interpretations of what the random rollable tables give you. But it's up to you when to ask a question and how chaotic you want the results to be. It's noted here that solo play loses the social aspect of RPGs, but that you also gain the advantage of making your adventure as big or as small as you want, and really as weird as you want. I'll cover what I think all the pros and cons of Mythic's approach and solo play in general are at the end of this video. One notable feature of this book, which at the time of recording is still only available in PDF, is its bold summary blocks found at the beginning of every section that contains a new concept. On your first read through, these big block texts don't make too much sense because they recap information on the following pages. But on your second read through and ever thereafter, when you're looking for something specific, these are incredibly handy for scanning and finding concepts. In this first example here, you're given a summary of maybe the most important core activity of the toolset, fate questions. To quote the author here, as you play through an adventure, you improvise the details based on what you expect your character to experience. You can pause your improvisation at any time to test an expectation with a fate question. Usually, you do this during a moment of narrative tension or when you're unsure of what will happen next. Asking a fate question is a tad bit complex at first, but you do it so often in the course of play that it really becomes second nature. First, you need to focus your question on active and interesting elements. Let's say, for example, that I'm playing Vaesen by myself. Vaesen is a game by Free League that, at least initially, takes place in 19th century Sweden, where you play as someone who can see folkloric and mythical creatures known as, well, Vaesen. You're usually tasked with solving a mystery that involves Vaesen causing trouble. In this example, let's say my player character, Anna, spots a strange creature at night in the shadows in the streets of Uppsala. I want to ask a fate question at this point, but I don't want to base it on my desires as much as on my expectations. And I want the question to be a yes or no, where a yes would lead to more action or activity. Let's say that my question is the movement in the shadows that I see actually a Vaesen? I would then need to determine the odds of a yes to that question. By default is 50-50, but depending on the context, I use my judgment to choose the odds. Let's go to this chart here, a chart that you will come back to pretty much constantly in the course of using Mythic. You can see on the top left the range of odds going from certain all the way to impossible. Let's say in my example, the odds are very likely since Anna has been stalking the Vaesen for 2 days and is currently carrying a talisman that attracts such creatures. My next step is to refer to my current chaos factor. This is an overarching value that throws another layer of probability onto the fate question dice roll. The higher the chaos factor, the higher the chance that my question will be answered with a yes. Let's say that my chaos factor is 5 right now. With odds of very likely and a chaos factor currently at 5, if I roll a 75 or below on a D100, the answer is yes. If I roll above 75, the answer is no. There are also a couple of little numbers on the left and right there. Those represent exceptional yes and exceptional no. A roll of 15 or below is an exceptional yes, meaning in this case maybe it's not just a Vaesen that Anna spots in the shadow, but 3 of them traveling as a pack. If I roll above 96, that means it's an exceptional no, which could be interpreted as no, not only is it not a Vaesen, it's my nemesis who has been trying to stymie my investigation. So right here you might already be seeing a challenge with solo roleplay, and that is interpretation. On one hand, you're playing in the shoes of a player character who has their own needs, motivations, and desires. But on the other, you're playing as a narrator and referee who needs to interpret 4 degrees of yes and no. You're also warned here not to ask too many fate questions and not to make them too specific. So in other words, there are a number of balancing acts that you commit to here. These fate questions have an outsized role in using Mythic in that they can potentially replace the actual rules of the RPG you're trying to play. Instead of rolling using your game's conflict resolution mechanic, such as, do I hit the thing when I fire my flintlock or not, you can sub in a fate question to get your answer. You just need to set the chaos factor to the default of 5 when doing so. If you happen to roll doubles on your fate roll and that duplicated number is equal to or less than the current chaos factor, then you get a random event. You have to determine 3 things when a random event is triggered. The context, it needs to make sense and jibe with the current situation. Event focus, which is determined randomly on a table that you see on the right there. And event meaning, which is 2 words randomly generated and interpreted by you. The context thing is pretty intuitive and doesn't need any explaining, but this event focus table introduces a lot of the meat of Mythic and illustrates how clever this system really is. When it comes to NPCs and threads, which are quests, tasks, and missions in your adventure, you keep a running tally of them and update them on lists after every scene. Sometimes an NPC or thread will get multiple entries, up to 3, and sometimes they will get stricken from your list if they aren't relevant anymore. But what's cool is that these lists act as rollable tables when certain kinds of random events are triggered. That means your random event is not completely random. It's often keyed to the elements of your actual adventure at hand. Furthermore, you can pre-stock these lists in order to shape and direct your adventure. If, for example, you're trying to play through a published adventure and need to be focused on specific characters and story arcs. The final element in random events is the event meaning, which come in actions, descriptions, and elements. You roll a D100 twice and try to interpret those 2 words. This can be pretty challenging if your brain isn't trained to creatively associate random words with concrete, contextual scene interpretations, but it's a way to apply a final layer of dramatic heft and life to your random event. You could probably use Mythic for decades and not get the same 2 words twice, so that's pretty fun. There are actually a ton more tables like these in other parts of the system, so as far as replayability and avoiding redundancy, Mythic is very strong. There are 4 kinds of scenes in the Mythic system. The first scene, expected scene, altered scene, and interrupt scene. When it comes to the first scene, the idea is to get the story going, and there are multiple techniques or approaches on how to create it. The one I think I like the most is the 4W strategy, which is summarized here on the right. Using roles on various meaning tables, you define the who, what, where, and when of the scene. As for expected scenes, they are the following scenes that you expect to take place after any given scene. You usually base this on what you decide your character plans to do in the fiction, but it can go in one of 3 ways, depending on how you roll against the current chaos factor. It either goes as expected, or it could be an altered scene, or an interrupt scene. Altered scenes are an expected scene that are changed in one way or another. You can see the main strategies for changing up a scene to make it altered here in these big, bold text blocks. Interrupt scenes are where just about anything can happen, and they're generated in the same way that you generate a random event. You just go from scene to scene in this way, using one of 5 different approaches on how to come up with the next scene. Some are simulationist friendly, while others are more theatrically oriented, as summarized in this chart. And here's another summary of the 5 ways to start and end scenes. Anytime you need to generate more specific meaning or details for a scene, you can confer with one of the 45 D100 tables listed here. These tables, once you get comfortable with the sheer volume of them, are a huge resource when playing Mythic. But that being said, the burden is still on you to interpret the results. Taking any 2 random words from a table and massaging them into a coherent element of your scene is probably either a lot of fun for you or it breaks your brain. Like I mentioned earlier, anytime you finish a scene, you manage your list of threads and NPCs, adding new stuff that might be relevant and removing items that no longer seem important to the story. One other thing that you do is adjust your chaos factor, either to swing your story a little bit more towards action or towards predictability. There are a bunch of interesting ideas later in the book that suggest ways for you to record your progress in an adventure. There are the worksheets that the book comes with, which might be the first place you go to when starting off. After that, you might think that journaling is the next step in solo adventuring. But the author also suggests blogging your adventures, or even turning them into novels that are built one scene at a time. Another fascinating concept is to use one's own library of RPG and non-RPG books as random sources for inspiration. This is a really cool way to engage one's book collection. I don't want to get too into the details of thread progress tracks, but it's worth mentioning that this is where Sean Tompkin of Ironsworn and Starforged fame got his idea of vow progression tracks. Progress is made on a thread in Mythic anytime your character does something significant in moving toward that thread's conclusion. If you want to focus very specifically on a thread in your adventure here, progress is made on a thread in Mythic anytime your character does something significant in moving towards that thread's conclusion. And each time they do, you mark 2 boxes on a track. The track is either 10, 15, or 20 boxes long in total, and will occasionally trigger a flashpoint or important moment that is related to the thread. There's also this concept called keyed scenes, which are specific kinds of scenes that you want to be included in your adventure, and which can be triggered by anything of your design. This is a clever way to exert more control of your adventure, especially if you're using a published adventure. Alright, here are my thoughts on Mythic Game Emulator 2nd Edition. Makes RPGs non-social. One of the big reasons to play tabletop RPGs is to experience the social aspect of it. That almost goes without saying. Mythic opens the door to extended solitude in play, for better or worse. Burden of interpretation. Coming up with the yes or no fate questions might be a bit of a challenge at first, but the real work comes with interpreting 4 shades of yes or no, as well as the dozen other places where you're interpreting things like random word pairs and changing the chaos factor. These are not creative muscles that you normally use in RPGs, but if you want to be both player and GM at your table, you have to get used to extrapolating meaning and direction with relatively minimal guidance. Doesn't need an RPG. I guess this is both a pro and a con. On the one hand, the fact that you can so easily sidestep an RPG's rules by using a fate question means that you might be tempted to ignore an RPG's mechanics rather than be bothered to look it up. What this means is that Mythic might not be the best way to learn an RPG, since there's no incentive to use a game's actual rules. On the other hand, not being required to use a game's rules really frees you up to make the most interesting story. After all, your ultimate objective with Mythic is to make an intriguing story, either for yourself or maybe an audience that reads your adventures in a blog or written fiction form. And you don't have to let an RPG's rules minutia get in your way. Impressive rules infrastructure. Even if you haven't read the first version of Mythic or any of the other works adjacent to this toolset, you can tell that this 2nd edition is extremely well polished in terms of its organization and in how every last tool has been playtested and tweaked. In this video, I skipped over a few aspects of the system, like the simplified fate check system where you use 2d10 instead of a d100, or the NPC builder and emulator. But just in terms of what I did cover in this video, it's an incredible decision-making engine. Example after example. The book is riddled with small rules examples that make every last concept crystal clear. With regard to being pedagogical, I'm not sure I've seen a better RPG rulebook. It teaches, reinforces, and reminds in a way that is visually appealing and clearly worded. And just to put a giant cherry on top, there is a huge example of play at the end of the book just to reinforce all the concepts of the toolset. rules and tables at the end. Just as an addendum to that last point, all the rules and tables are recapped at the end of the book so that you have an easy to reference guide after you've already read the book and need a refresher on one thing or another. Look, nothing is going to replace that feeling of collaborating with friends and weaving a story together in the form of a role-playing game, but the Mythic Game Master emulator isn't trying to replace that. It's trying to provide a completely different experience, one where you are alone with your imagination and a setting of your choice, and where you can go anywhere at any time, regardless of other people's schedules and preferences. It's a different animal when it comes to gaming. And Mythic is certainly not the only Oracle on the market, but when someone spends 20 years polishing their tools and learns how to present them as cleanly as they are presented here, you pretty much have to give it a shot. If you'd like to keep this kind of content flowing, please consider joining my Patreon. Links for that and for where to find Mythic 2nd Edition are below. Thanks for watching. See ya.